I wanted to create a safe space to have uncomfortable yet transformative conversations that move people, amplifying the voices of those who are underrepresented and who inspire positive change. I'm Toni Williams, and this is Brooklyn Savvy. We're going to be talking about hair justice on this episode of Brooklyn Savvy. We have this really robust discussion on the roots of hair. So, Lurie, first of all, I want to say that your book,
Memories of a Nappy-Headed Black Girl,
every ounce of that book, every page of that book, I related to.
Wow.
You know, from the hair. The one thing that you had, though, was length, so I don't know what you complained about. I was like, why is she complaining? She had length. But be that as it may, talk to us about the roots of hair and how it intersects with racism. I know there is this word texturism, but racism in this country.
Sure, and thank you so much for your kind words. One of the things that I wanted to talk about in that book was the fact that prior to the enslavement of African people, prior to colonization, which I place at around the end of 1492, beginning of 1500, that year span, there is nothing in the historical record. There's nothing either in our oral history, our written history. There's nothing on the walls of pyramids, nothing in the libraries from the ancient times that would ever suggest that prior to being told that we had to have a European standard of beauty in order to access power in our society, there is no evidence that Black women or Black men were searching for a magical juice or berry in the bush to make their hair turn straight or to make their skin lighter. That does not happen until a system of domination and enslavement forcibly trafficked, we should say, African people by the millions from our natural space where we were perfectly content with our rituals. We had time and systems in place culturally that would allow us to care for our hair. We all know that you cannot just get up and go with natural hair. It takes time. There is a process. And we had the rituals. We had language through our hair. Ayanna Bird and Lurie Tharp in their book, Hair Story, talk about the fact that you could identify your community group, your position in that society, your role, and how you were related to other people.
By your hairstyle.
By your hair texture. It was another form of communication. It is only when racism is created as a justification for the enslavement of African people, and we were told that our hair was animalistic. We were told that it was a sign of our inferiority. It, in and of itself, was a sign of our inferiority. That is when we began realizing that there are benefits that one could secure in the society if one had straighter hair or lighter skin, and that is the birth of texturism, that is the birth of colorism, and that is really the time when we began to see Black women and Black men, because Black boys failed the doll test too, began to adopt ideas that basically tied our access to power with how straight our hair was or how light our skin was.
So let's talk about internalized racism, right? I mean, so we're dealing with all of these issues and we want to manipulate our hair so that we are more beautiful. But that's a lie.
Yeah.
So talk about that piece of it, that underlying piece, that piece that robs us of dignity, that robs us of self-esteem, that does real psychic damage to us.
Absolutely. There's something very dangerous about learning to view your worth and your value through the eyes of people who have based their entire national economy and state of being on your oppression. Very, very dangerous to take that perspective through which one evaluates yourself, whether it comes to your sense of intelligence, whether it comes to your sense of your personal capacity or the capacity of your people, and certainly when it comes to your aesthetic. And so I use a phrase in the book, a Black white supremacist, which is how I describe myself. I am a Black person who learned to value whiteness over my own skin, who learned to value hair textures from white communities over that of my own. I had to go through a process, and I analogize it to being addicted. And when you have an addiction of any sort, be it alcohol or any sort of narcotic, there's a process. We now recognize AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, for those who are addicted to alcohol. Before, it was considered a moral failing. We now know it as a medical condition. We, as people of African descent who have been force-fed this perspective that says we are not beautiful unless we can closely approximate whiteness, we too have an addiction that must be worked out in safe spaces for our people that will allow us to really learn the history about why it is we think these things, understand how it impacts not just our standard of beauty, even our understanding of our capacity as Black people. A lot of our inability to work together is because we don't believe that Black people can accomplish certain things.
In each other. We don't believe
in each other.
Valerie, do you want to add to that?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's it's an addiction, but it's also something that's ingrained in our very being as a society.
Yes.
Because if we did not have that replacement of capacity, replacement of beauty, replacement of who we were as a person, then the ability to keep us in a place of enslavement would have been not successful.
Right.
So unless we recognize that this was done deliberately, intentionally, socialized in our very being, almost to the fact that those of us who are the descendants of these slaves, it's in our DNA, right? So it has to be taken out of us. And a process like removing addiction is very similar to that process. And that the other thing I'll say is that you talked about us in a collaborative nature. The collaboration in those days meant death, right? And punishment. So we have to step away from that as a people, as well as how we look aesthetically and the beauty of that and the strength of that in the people that we are of African descent.
Ashe.
Can I just add, though, that even though it is systemic, it is ingrained, there's always been a resiliency that existed,
Yes.
right? There's always been that undercurrent of Blackness, whether it was unity, whether it was the aesthetic, that has survived.
That's right.
And I think we need to highlight that more and show that more, and that will help combat what's already ingrained.
That's right. One of the greatest sources of strength is being reminded of what our ancestors were able to accomplish. And I'm not just talking about the ancestors. That we're still here. That's right. That's right.
You know, and that's not a small feat by any stretch of the imagination. I was talking to my sister, and she says she's been doing a lot of work in terms of antebellum, slavery, all of that. And she said that when she sees a Black person now, she wants to salute us. You know, because of what we have come through. But I want to still talk a little bit about post-traumatic slave syndrome and slave conditioning. Because sometimes we can be our own worst enemy by not acknowledging our history, not being aware of it, and not unpacking.
So when you talk about acknowledging it, it's deliberate that you don't know it to acknowledge
That's
it, right? That's part of that whole systemic racism that we're fighting now. You look at Texas, right? And what they're doing with the school books in terms of not teaching history. But I was talking to somebody last night, and we were talking about the fact that the state of California is moving towards eliminating history courses at the college level. So you already don't get them in high school. Because if they're anything similar to New York, you only have to take a certain number of years in public high school history. But they're talking about eliminating it. And the conversation came up because I have a friend who's teaching history in California and is now looking to move out of state.
Wow.
Because she sees the writing on the wall. So when you have a society that, and this is not something that's a recent occurrence, this is something that's been happening for forever. Right? Because they always say history is the story of the winner, right? It's his story.
Absolutely.
It's never been our story.
Right.
It's never been her story. It's never been the Black story. It's always been the dominant story, the white story, the story of what they considered the winner, because we really won.
Yeah.
Right?
Because if we didn't talk about how we really won.
We're here.
Okay.
Right? They didn't want us here. They did not want us here. They did not want us to have any kind of sense of self-worth. They did not want us. The fact that we can sit here and have this conversation about hair when they tried everything in their power by even using the term, they didn't refer to our hair as hair. They referred to it as wool.
That's right.
Right? They took away our tools to do our hair. And what happened is during slavery, people who were enslaved found other tools to do our hair, right? Even though they tried to counter that. When they took away the dyes that we used to use, because we always colored our hair, right? We were fancy with it. Right, back on the continent. So being fancy with it now is not new for us. That's something that has carried on. That's ingrained in us. And so when they saw us took away the things for us to be fancy with it, we found other things. It wasn't as fancy because the materials we had were not as cultivated or as whatever, silk or whatever, but we still found ways to carry those traditions through. If you talk about, you started talking about earlier, how on the continent, different nations had status symbols, right? Your hair was a reflection of your status, of your marital status, of your economic status, could be of just your tribal affiliation, if you were underage. I mean, it was a variety of things. And we saw that those techniques, that sense of using hair to identify or to send messages survived slavery, right? It's how we got our rights here. It's how we got roadmaps. It's how we communicated in some senses. And so that, for me, is one of the ways that we can encounter and combat and acknowledge what people say we lost or that we didn't have.
I love everything you said. Love everything you said. But now let's unpack the fact that our hair and its texture impacts whether we can work or not, or what kinds of jobs we can get. And you were the architect of the Crown Act. Talk to us about the Crown Act and why it is so important.
Sure. Well, I'll just clarify a little bit.
Okay.
Because
Sure.
in terms of my role as a legal architect, so it's a little bit different.
That's all right.
In terms of that, because so much of this, in terms of the legislation, whether it's denominated a Crown Act or not, which is creating a respectful and open world or workplace for Natural Hair Act, really there's a legal impetus, a legal reason as to why we even need this civil rights legislation, which I have been publishing and writing about and advocating about and raising public awareness about for over 15 years now throughout this country and across 4 continents. And so essentially what we have is almost, now over 40 years of legal precedent within our federal court system that when we have these civil rights cases that have challenged natural hair discrimination or discrimination on the basis of afros, locks, braids, twists, bantu knots, and so forth as a form of race discrimination, our federal courts who have decided this issue, namely under our Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Title VII even more specifically, which prohibits racial discrimination in workplaces, they have created or articulated what I call a hair-splitting legal distinction.
Hair splitting.
Pun intended. And so essentially what they've said is that if you are discriminated against on the basis of an afro, then that would constitute unlawful race discrimination in violation of our federal civil rights laws. But if you lock, braid, or twist your afro and you're discriminated against or harassed on those grounds, lose employment opportunities, which happens systematically, then magically it's no longer about race. And it does not violate our prohibitions against racial discrimination because locks, braids, and twists are considered like cultural characteristics, mutable cultural characteristics that we can change. And since our federal civil rights laws don't prohibit discrimination on the basis of culture, employers are then free to engage in what I call the hyper-regulation of our bodies vis-a-vis our hair. So they can tell us how to wear our hair. They can tell us to cut off our hair, to straighten our hair as a condition of employment, to wear wigs and weaves as condition of employment. Even more recently, there's been a federal district court case where the federal judge said that an individual who was subjected to harassment where her coworkers actually circulated a petition around the office. A petition around the office that they were to sign if they considered her natural hairstyles to be unprofessional. That did not violate our federal civil rights laws, in particular Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which prohibits racial harassment in the workplace. So I just want to provide that legal context because basically what the Crown Act does is that it provides, it fills in that gap in civil rights protection as it relates to protection for afros or discrimination against afros, but not protection for those hairstyles that flow from an afro hair texture, right? And so the Crown Act provides a clarifying definition of race, which is actually groundbreaking because our civil rights statutes don't even have definitions of these protected categories. And the definition of race actually comes from my first publication. It's an iteration of this definition of race that I articulated in my first article in 2008. Which is Title VII, what's hair and other race-based characteristics got to do with it. And essentially what the legislation does, it acknowledges that natural hair discrimination is racial discrimination, and that clarifying definition of race provides that any characteristics or traits that are associated with race or historically or commonly or simply associated with race constitutes racial discrimination and violation of our civil rights statutes.
Well, you sound like a hero or a shero. That's what you sound like. That's what you sound like. A hero. A hero, Brooklyn. Valerie, why don't you tell your story?
I have a law degree as well, and I graduated from law school in '96. So during the time of your interviews, right, I wore braids and twists. Hi, Diane. For many years. But during interview, what you had to either put a wig on or get a weave or straighten your hair, and then just hope that if you got hired and you showed up, right, that that no one would say anything. So, and which is what I did. So I wore a twist to my job when I went to work on Wall Street at a financial firm. So I'm so pleased at the Crown Act because I had to maneuver this with twists for many years. But what bothers me is that, and I'll say in New York State, it just got passed in 2019. Yeah. So I'm talking about experiences I had in the 90s, and it's only, I believe, 18 states, like about a third of our country. The rest of the country, you can still be subject to these legal discriminations.
So what are we going to do to change that, though?
Well, we're hopeful that the Federal Crown Act will actually be passed. It has been passed twice already through the United States House of Representatives, and I had the privilege of being one of the advisors and experts and architects of the Federal Crown Act. So we hope that the Senate will actually do their jobs and vote on this, and then hopefully then maybe President Biden, if he's still the president at that time, will sign it into law. In between time, I think it's really important to note that there's really important work that is done on local and state levels as well in terms of the enforcement agencies.
I was going to ask you about that. Because quite honestly, you can be at work, you have a radical hairdo, the boss may not like it, so they do different kinds of things. Like your performance review might not be as high. They're still going to discriminate. So how do we protect against that?
No, you're exactly right. So people have had diminished or lower compensation when they've decided to wear their hair naturally. They've lost promotional opportunities, and all of the economic security that flows from these deprivations of employment opportunities. And so you're raising a really important point, because I think oftentimes we don't think about the economic part of it and the economic security that is really further guaranteed through our civil rights legislation. And in this case, we're talking about the Crown Act. So with respect to the enforcement agencies, there are some states and localities, even without the Crown Act, because of important enforcement guidance that actually does treat natural hair discrimination as a form of race discrimination, like the New York City Commission on Human Rights, which was, again, issued groundbreaking enforcement guidance to that effect. And we also have, administrative law judges who have decided these cases. Actually, they've been even more out front, frankly, in terms of the state and local enforcement agencies than, say, our federal government with respect to that, or even on like a statewide legislative kind of level. So, like, for example, we now have a similar type of legislation in Illinois, but back in 2010, we had an administrative law judge who decided that when two African-descendant men were barred from a bar because they were wearing braids, that violated their local anti-discrimination law that prohibited racial discrimination in public accommodations. So I just wanted to kind of point that out, is that, I don't put all of my eggs in the federal basket, and I don't put all of my eggs in the federal court basket either. Or even the federal legislative basket, and that we really should be thinking about the ways in which, these other enforcement bodies are playing a role in this.
I saw this on YouTube, this young man who was wrestling and had his locks cut. Mm-hmm. That is an illegal what that woman did.
Perhaps. Depending on the jurisdiction, depending on the way that particular jurisdictions, either their state constitution, their city charter, their municipal governing documents, all of that can have a real impact, which is why hopefully that federal legislation will come through so that it will set a floor. And you can always go above a floor, but you can't go beneath it. And that will set a baseline of rights that we will all be able to enjoy. However, I would also say that one of the things that's going to be fundamentally important to ensure that the federal legislation legislation has teeth, much like the Voting Rights Act. And as a voting rights, civil rights attorney, I just must stress this point. It is one thing to fight for a right to be established. It is another thing for the people to know they have a right and to take advantage of it. Until we do the work of deprogramming our internalized anti-blackness when it comes to our own aesthetic, we could have the federal legislation. We could have legislation up and down at the local level. But if we still believe that we are not beautiful with natural hair, if we still believe we must approximate whiteness, and if our lust and the politics of our desire and what we have told ourselves is attractive, if that is not also interrogated, there's going to be a limit to how much legislation can do.
Can I just said it right there?
I just want to add something. So what's I think will make it worse and make that, I can see happening is folks who want to do that, white folks who want to do that, will get black folks to do it for them.
Absolutely.
Right? And then you're going to end up in a court and they're going to say, well, they can't be discriminating against you because they're just like you. And I think that's going to add a whole nother level.
Well, you're talking about something really important, what I call equal opportunity discrimination. So we also engage in this kind of discrimination.
That's right.
And recently I've heard about, and we probably all know about this, where, we might be accepting of someone who wears natural hair styles or they have their hair in natural hair textures, but it depends on what kind of texture, right?
Or the occasion.
Yeah, or the occasion.
Perhaps for work, but not for a wedding.
Exactly.
Right.
Or you can, it's
Or
okay
not
if
for
you,
work.
Right.
And okay for the wedding.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's all of these things. So some recent cases have involved, black people in the workplace who have been discriminated against other black people, not simply because they're wearing natural hair, but because they perceive that particular natural hairstyle as not being sufficiently professional or like kind of dusty or dirty looking.
Yes, we do that to each other.
Yeah,
We'll do it. We will.
That individual making the complaint, right? Because I'm black too, so if you wear your hair like that, it's going to impact me.
Trying to teach the courts what it means to have internalized anti-blackness is a very difficult step.
Speak more about that, because I think that is the root of the tragedy that has happened to us.
So in these situations where you all may have seen the cases where there's a school, a black school that's run by black people, black principal, everybody black from the rooter to the tutor, and a little boy perhaps comes in. So we've got a gender issue, right? A little boy comes in with locks, and his locks are not acceptable because it's not a neat hairstyle.
Yeah.
Or her braids are not acceptable, it's not a neat hairstyle. When neatness is really a code for white, and when grooming standards are really a substandard or a replacement for an aesthetic that we consider to be professional, that is internalized anti-blackness. So long as because think about it, your hair right now, Toni, beautifully combed out, if you were white and had a white texture, as your hair combed out, it would fall to your shoulders.
Right,
it wouldn't be your fault if your hair were limp. It doesn't reach to the sky. It's not their fault. But your hair does. If you were to put a band on your afro right now and pull it back, we would call it an Afro puff. If a white or a European textured person puts a band on their hair, it's called a ponytail. The exact same style, but our textures do something different. And so long as I am expecting my texture to approximate a standard that is appropriate for a European textured hair, that is internalized anti-blackness, because our black hair has its own standard. We would not expect somebody, its own standard.
You said something that I think a lot of people miss. When you were describing, her hair coming out and going up, and you said it's not their fault if the hair comes out and goes limp if it doesn't reach to the sky.
That's
and
unfortunate.
I think a lot of people didn't hear that you didn't say it's not your fault.
That's right.
That your hair doesn't grow down.
That was intentional.
I know it was. I know it was.
So it's interesting and ironic that we're having this conversation, and we can look proudly at Ketanji Brown Jackson
Yes.
with natural hair sitting on the Supreme Court, but we still are fighting this fight.
Yes,
right?
yes,
What is
absolutely.
the irony of that?
I wanted to dig into, with the little time we have, this idea of interrogating oneself as black people. What kinds of questions do black folks need to ask themselves to really understand the fact that we can be racist against ourselves?
I think Malcolm X asked those questions really well. Who taught you to hate yourself? Who taught you your nose needed to be straight? Who taught you, where did that come from? And if we know we have no record of this existing as even a concept prior to enslavement, prior to colonization, this is a function of whiteness, which is designed to serve the interests of white European powers, which we are still seeing reflected today. So my thing is this: it would be one thing if somebody could point to me in a pyramid where there was black women looking for the magical berry where they've got an afro bush one day and straight hair the next, and they're praising Ra. That does not happen. And so because that doesn't happen, we have to really ask ourselves, why do I think this way? Why do I think my skin needs to be lighter to be beautiful? Why do I think I need length, as they were talking about in the other segment, for my hair to be beautiful? Where did that come from? And if that came as a part of a system that was designed to serve whiteness, if it came as a part of a system where an entire nation had based their economy, their national security, their entire policy platform on oppressing black people so that they could get millions of us to work for free for life, so they could sit on a porch and sip mint juleps while we were whipping up the cotton, we have got to say, I have to walk away and be okay with the fact that it is uncomfortable. There's going to be a and just the fact that we have a lot of, we're in Brooklyn, which is the Afro capital of the world. There are a lot of people in this country who do not get the benefit of seeing all of this all day long. So long as that is the case, we have work to do, because we're not just talking about here. On the continent of Africa, bleaching creams and hair straightening products.
Well, in India, too.
India, best-selling products throughout the entirety of the Caribbean. So whiteness is an international standard that has only existed for a couple of hundred years. It's a very new thing. And because it's a very new thing and we have ancient roots, pun intended, we are able to do the work once we recognize the work must be done.
Wow. Thank you so much, Lurie, for all that you're bringing to this. And Dr. Wendy Greene, thank you for the work that you're doing. You are what did you say? I said shero, but you had some. A hero. And to my ladies here, thank you so much. And we'll see you next time on Brooklyn Savvy.
The question about how to prove racial discrimination. So it can be challenging. It really just depends, because there are some companies that have express policies that prohibit natural hairstyles like braids or locks or twists. In those types of cases, we would call that like a facially discriminatory policy on the basis of race. Unfortunately, oftentimes federal courts have not found those to be racially discriminatory, or at least in violation of our federal civil rights laws, even though it's very clear that they're trying to target African-descended workers with respect to that. And even when there's been evidence that almost 99% of the individuals who have been affected by those policies or have been regulated by those policies or disciplined by those policies have been African-descended workers. Actually filing a complaint, you can do that internally. Sometimes it is unfortunate, as you mentioned, that even HR, the people who are in HR are engaging in that kind of discrimination and don't view it as a form of unlawful discrimination, unfortunately. If you're in that kind of situation, then you could potentially file a claim with the EEOC, or the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, under our federal civil rights laws, like Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, or possibly Section 1981 of the 1866 Civil Rights Act that prohibits intentional racial discrimination in the workplace context. And I would even go on to say filing a lawsuit or claim or charge with your local or your state enforcement agency, because there can be some different types of procedures and possibly more expansive protection as it relates to your state and local civil rights statutes prohibiting racial discrimination than what is currently the case under federal civil rights law.